Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing on our journey through the Tao Te Ching. And I will go ahead and pull that up. Okay. So we are already in chapter 67. So making some good progress. And today we're going to work with Robert's translation, which is a little bit more. He definitely attempts to bring in or retain more of the poetic aspect. So it's his word choice is going to be a little bit interesting as we go through this. But I think overall, he captured some key points to this chapter that we want to make sure we address. So this is the one we're using today. And it starts with, all the world declares me great. Now, this doesn't exactly sound Taoist, does it? And this has been this opening line, a subject of a lot of variation. Well, I shouldn't say a lot of variation, primarily two different ways of translating it, where people have strong opinions about one versus the other. So, in the textual history of the Daodejing, we have a couple of different ancient manuscripts that have been uncovered, and then there's been ones that have been preserved and maintained, which has been what they refer to is like the received text, and the earlier ones are ones that were discovered later through archaeology. Some of them as late as the 70s, and so there's a variety of sources that they can go to for looking at what did the original Tao Te Ching have as far as its text, because there's some subtle differences between them. And this is one of those lines where we see some differences. And in all of the, as far as I understand, in all of the known ancient translation or preservations of the Tao Te Ching, it does not, it reads essentially what we're seeing here. But there was an early commentary on the Tao Te Ching that actually added in after me the word Tao. And so then it would read, all the world declares my Tao great, which would seem to be more in keeping with the way the Tao Te Ching would talk about a lot of other things. They've talked about the great Tao several times. But there's a couple things that would be interesting if I had access to somebody who was a little bit more schooled in classical Chinese, because the word that's being translated me here is "wa," I think is how it's pronounced, and it would mean I or me. But if you wanted to say something like our, you would first change it to we, so it'd be wa ma, and then you would add da, and that would be like possessive, so it would be ours, and it would be our da. If you wanted to make it mine, it would be wa da, the possessive again. So it really would read I Dao or me Dao great, which I guess maybe could be shorthand for how you would say my Dao. But it just seems like it doesn't quite follow, at least a little bit that I know about the grammar so far. So it seems like it doesn't quite read right unless you allow for an abbreviated way of saying my or our, which some of the translators have said is legitimate, but sometimes it seems like they say that because that's the way the text is appears to them and they're just assuming. But if Dao was added in, then it would make sense that this is kind of flowing a little bit awkwardly. But what would it mean to not have Tao in that sentence? Well, you might notice that this translator has this line in quotes. So, one of the things that we have seen as well several times is each of the chapters, not each of them, but most of them will open up with kind of a challenging quote or challenging phrase that then the rest of the chapter tries to unpack. And so, what Roberts is suggesting here is that this would be a line that, let's say, the emperor might say, all the world declares me great. Okay, so this isn't me in the sense of Lao Tzu saying this. This is me in the sense of somebody who fancies himself the leader, or maybe actually is the leader, a way that they might make a declaration, and then he's going to challenge it. So then from Lao Tzu's response, or the Tao Te Ching's response, would be great, but do not seem to be. And I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of how this line is handled. It's much harder to make, especially this opening couple of lines, make sense with adding the word Tao in that first line. I can understand why there's a temptation to go with that, because it seems to be easier to make it fit the theme of the Daodejing, but I think it's messing up the point that's trying to be made here. So we're going to roll with this one and see how this all unfolds. So then the counter here, be great but do not seem to be, is a common theme we see where there's if you want to lead, you got to act like, we just looked at this last week, that you should be seeming like you're the servant, right? That you should be below the people. Or if you're trying to be in front, that you should seem as though you're in the back. And so this would definitely be, the type of counsel that would be given if someone is either desiring to be great or is trying to declare themselves great. This would be an appropriate Taoist counter to that assertion. And it continues then, for it is seeming not to be, in this case, seeming not to be great, that makes you great. Otherwise, by seeming so, in other words, by seeming to be great, you'd long ago have ceased to matter. So definitely creating a challenge to this idea of calling oneself great, and saying that it is in seeming not to be that you may end up finding yourself elevated. So in that previous chapter that we just looked at, it was all focused on this idea. So there's a really natural transition from chapter 66 to 67 when we see this approach. And it definitely makes a lot of sense if that opening line is actually a quote, or it might not be a literal quote, but an example of what someone who would find themselves in a position of power might be tempted to say about themselves. Well, actually, before I go on to this, any thoughts about this opening kind of back and forth dialogue?
Yeah, to me it's just saying like not don't brag, but don't be like, look at me, like I'm so great. you know, like just exhibit it. You don't have to like boast about it, you know?
Yeah, it's almost more like, if you're the guy, you're not going to have to tell anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So then, with this kind of in mind, that there is a way of being great without trying to be great, or without aiming to be great or claiming to be great, that something in your essence essentially is going to elicit other people to essentially proclaim you as great, right? This is kind of what we saw in the last chapter, that you don't have to, if you have to claim it for yourself, then you've missed it, right? It has to be something that's kind of granted to you, that people naturally want you to be in that position. And that's when you belong in that position, is a lot of the path that happened last chapter, and I see flowing into this one.
Yeah, it's like going on to Achievers and submitting a bunch for yourself.
And if anybody's watching this that isn't sure what Achievers is, this is an app that a company can use to create essentially like a social media platform to brag about your coworkers, and help them to feel good and give them points and that kind of thing. So to go on and brag about yourself on Achievers would be kind of interesting, which is maybe what a lot of people do on social media. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. So then it's going to seem like it transitions a little bit. And this is another reason why I feel that Robert's approach to this is on track, because in the other translations where it says my Tao is great and everybody, likes it, but it doesn't seem like the normal thing. And if it was just like normal, everybody else would not appreciate it. Okay, that would be one way you could approach it. But then this next section felt like a weird kind of an abrupt change. But with Robert's approach here, where it's starting off with a rebuttal and saying that there is a way of being great that is essentially um, granted to you, then I think this next section makes a lot more sense. We have we have always, excuse me, we have always our triple treasure. Again, he's got kind of this poetic way of writing it, so sometimes it's a little tricky to read, which we rely upon and cherish. And this is probably one of the more famous lines of the Daodejing, is what the three treasures are, or sometimes it's referred to as the three jewels: a mother's heart, a fugal hand, and no drive to boldly lead this world. So here we have um, this first one, a mother's heart, is frequently translated either as compassion or kindness. And then a fugal hand sometimes is translated as being simple or simplicity. And then no drive to boldly lead this world. Uh, so again, given the opening, this would make a lot of sense where this applies about not trying to take that lead or having the drive to seek that out. But let's look at the other, all three of these here for just a moment. So, mother's heart is an interesting translation of this phrase. There's the term here is relating to something that's akin to parental uh, concern or parental love for a child. And it may be that this is being used in contrast to the Confucian. One of its primary characteristics that it looks for is this idea of filial piety, which is frequently challenged in the Tao Te Ching. You might recall there's a passage where it talks about the social order essentially breaking down. And as it continues to break down, it gets to the point, when you have to have, essentially orders or commands for filial piety, in other words, how the parents should treat their children and how the children should respond to the parents. That says things have really broken down, because this should be a natural response. If you're dealing with a healthy relationship within the family, that nobody has to tell you how to love your kids or for your kids to love you. It's just a natural bond when things are happening in more of a natural flow. And yet in Confucianism, it's a lot about recognizing a hierarchy of placement. Where do you exist in this hierarchy, and what are your responsibilities to those above you, and what are your responsibilities to those below you? And so filial piety is something that's strongly discussed in terms of, there's obligations. This is how a child is supposed to act. This is what a parent does. And if you fall outside those lines, then, it's a sign of dishonor. So here, it's not using that same concept or term for filial piety. It's talking about this idea of parental love, but it's likely that this has to do more with how it's translated here as a mother's heart. And in one of the early commentaries on this, it even opens up with talking about this idea of the mother's concern or the mother's love for her child. And we've also seen that there's a lot of emphasis on the female approach within the Tao Te Ching, with this frequent reference to the idea of mother and also to the female. And we've explored how this has to do with kind of exploring that yin yang balance. And this is more of that emphasis on the yin that's kind of coming back into the flow. So I think it makes sense to develop this idea with this first term more specifically as this ideas of a mother's heart. And this being one of the key uh, treasures in this case that it's talking about, that is at the heart of how they look at Taoism, or the concepts that are being developed here in the Daodejing. And then the same we could say about the frugal hand. There's a lot about simplicity. There's a lot about not chasing after greed, not chasing after fancy things or valuing things as more expensive or having more social value. So this idea of being frugal, of not just wasting your money, and being careful about how you work with what you have, makes a lot of sense with what we've seen. And then, of course, not trying to become the leader would also make a lot of sense. So before I continue with where this goes next, any thoughts about these three treasures? And would these maybe be the three that you would have picked out if you're trying to summarize the core, let's say, values that you see within the Tao Te Ching?
That's a big question.
So is the final statement like the no drive to boldly lead this world, referring to the concepts of, just going with it, going with the flow?
Well, I think it has more to do with the idea. It's kind of like, excuse me, like the concept da, that has to do with the natural expression of Tao, that there's a way that is a consequence of being somebody who's trying to pay attention and follow the ways of Tao. But if you're specifically seeking after Da itself, then you kind of mess it up. So in this case, they still have a concept of a leader or of an emperor. And in their case, they see it more as the idea of like a sage emperor. But the ideal person in this case isn't somebody who's actually chasing after that position. It's somebody that other people actually want to have in that position, because they are the kind of person that actually helps everybody else to flourish, right? So it's not that if you chase after leadership, it's almost like chasing after duh. It doesn't work. It has to be a natural consequence of other actions. In this case, of being more in tune with Tao, then you become the kind of person who's actually capable of leading, that other people are going to want you to be the leader. Does that make sense, Dwayne?
It does make sense, but it brings up like the contradiction you face, which is people who want power strive for it and use a whole bunch of techniques to get it, and in a lot of cases do get it because of their cunning or whatever political tools they use. Whereas someone that does not necessarily want to lead, but would be a good leader because of the lower ambition, not for power necessarily, but for other means, they're less likely to gain the position.
Yeah, we definitely see a lot of that in this particular political cycle, don't we?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I would say that these three things, right? Simplicity, patience, basically, and humility are a really good, like, bottom level of the pyramid, but I don't think they're the only things. Like, I would say having integrity and being loyal and things like that. Like, there are other things that I think are important, but I think these are a really good basis to help you achieve the other things
Hmm.
that are also necessary.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because where it goes next is how these things become, in a sense, kind of a base for other things.
Oh,
So yeah,
okay, cool.
good observation.
I didn't read ahead on this one, so I didn't have that preloaded.
No cheating. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see where it takes us next. A brave heart takes a mother's heart. So, some of the other ways that this is translated is that a mother's heart allows you to be brave or to have courage. And so this kind of reversed the order a little bit, but you get the same idea that this idea of courage or a brave heart begins with or has at its root or its base, as Taylor was saying, this idea of a mother's heart. And you can just think of, how we say something like, don't get between a mother and her child, right? Like that type of love that a mother has for her child is going to make her face impossible odds in order to do whatever she can to protect that child. And so you can see where this idea of a brave heart or that idea of courage comes from, or has at its base this idea then of this very strong bond between a mother and her children. And then a similar thing, if you're going to be generous, or in this case it says giving, then it says a giving hand, again, kind of implying what we saw in the first line, is coming from or takes a frugal hand to begin with. It's in that frugality that you have the means then in order to be generous or to expand or to give, because you've actually been able to have a base that you can come from, right? And then the final one, and one who will not lead to serve as the sacred elder of this world. So I like the phrasing there of sacred elder as a way of kind of talking about that sage king, right? But it's like the one who will not lead, in this case, then will serve as the sacred elder of this world. Again, the base, right? Where does it come from? Here, the order didn't get reversed like the other two, but it's the same kind of concept. Any thoughts on how this plays out?
It reminds me of Josh because he's always on a team and then they always kind of like elevate him. They want him to be the leader because he's very helpful and he's very smart, but he doesn't want to be a manager. So this is making me think about him and in those situations where that happens to him.
Yeah. And that
Um,
would be a
yeah.
really good example of something like that. There's also a little bit of a yin yang here, isn't there? Right? Because we've got,
Yeah, that was my initial thought too, is they've got the yin and then they've got the yang on
mhm.
the second half there.
Yeah, so it kind of transitions or it becomes, like Taylor said, the base or the foundation, allowing these other things to happen, which expands the possibilities of what things can be achieved. But it's because there's attention to, or maybe cherishing, these initial treasures, right? Like the things that are the core values allow this expansiveness to happen where more things are possible. Then it
Yeah,
continues.
so I have a question. So you've got the brave heart takes a mother's heart, which is obviously yin. Is there something in the middle about the frugal hand and then you've got yang on the bottom? Or I guess where would you package a giving hand, a frugal hand? Would that be a yin or a yang leaning statement?
That's a good question. So I can see different ways in which this could be viewed on, they could map to either side depending on how you're looking at it, right? So if you think about Jan as being more controlling and more fixed, you could see that as like this idea of frugality in the sense almost of like being stingy, um, or maybe even selfish. whereas the giving hand could be seen in more yin terms in the sense of things growing or newness. But they could also go the other direction, where the frugal hand could be more on the inside in the sense of carefully nurturing, right? And then the giving could be seen as more expansive or expanding, which could be more of a yin type of an activity. Because they mapped it to the same side as a sense as the mother's heart, I'm going to go with the assumption that in this case the frugal side is being thought of in terms of the yin side, so that yin is again the foundation for how the yang happens. And this is an interesting concept as well, because frequently the yin side is more invisible. It's the side that you don't really see. It maps more to this idea of absence, but it's that foundation, it's this absence that actually allows for the birth of presence, right? And again, the yin has to do with this generative aspect. So these things might seem almost more like invisible, right? This idea of the mother's heart gives rise to bravery, and maybe bravery is the thing that we mostly see, but we're not paying attention to the background or the yin, which would seem to be a little bit more invisible. And so I think that's the kind of the direction. Same thing about the person who's not striving for leadership, right? They're not necessarily visible in the sense of being in the public eye, but somehow they end up getting elevated to the public eye. And so, yeah, I think there's that kind of yin yang relationship, in that there's the less noticed or the more kind of invisible or the less prized, maybe could be a way of looking at it, that is the source or the foundation of these other things that are typically associated with being more yang.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so another key aspect then that we're seeing is, with this concern about the yin, is it becomes that foundation, right? That place from which all these other things grow and develop. So then we have, what happens if you go the other direction? Forsaking love, in this case, the mother's heart, for bravery. So the idea that you're just going straight to, I want to be brave, right? And we're going to see this with the next three as well. Again, the idea of forsaking frugal hand for giving hand, and staying back for leading forth, right? So if you just jump to that yang side, that more prized side, let's say, the public side, the thing that seems to have more of the glory. The question is, well, what happens then if you just go straight to that and you ignore these three treasures that maybe are a little bit forgotten? Says, mean entering the gates of death. So we gotta love how they, bring things to some of these extreme pictures. But it's, if we are thinking again from the perspective, not just as the individual, but as a country, right? If we're starting with the question of the leaders thinking that I am great and everyone calls me great, and the council is to, like, essentially say, back up, here's what needs to happen if you're going to actually truly be great, right? If somebody is chasing these other things, you can see how that can lead to disaster. Because if you're just going for the bravery, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're like this great warlord, or that you're just like going out and conquering? Well, if that aspect of how you deal with your military strength isn't based first in this idea of love, then you could turn out to be like this horrible ruler, right? That's just out conquering and killing, because your foundation isn't that you're based in, again, that idea of the mother's love. Same thing with giving, which can also, again, be this idea of expanding or growth, right? we can think from a nation perspective, this idea of just, again, like this reaching out and conquering, even though it sounds like this idea of giving, it's really more this idea of expansiveness. And so there's challenges we can see in what would happen if it goes down that road, or if it was even just literally thinking about it in the giving, but you're giving from a place where you don't have a foundation, then you might give everything away, right? There's a problem with that as well. And then the same thing, if you forsake, holding back for leading forth, then you're moving into this position of leadership and maybe you're not really qualified for it, right? All these things then is being suggested that it leads to disaster. And in this case, it's taking it to definitely that hyperbolic extreme of death. But really, if you're talking about a nation state and foreign relations, or you can even think about the context of the Warring States period, the idea of these things being out of order or out of balance, leading to death, is not really out of character for what they're experiencing.
That's a steep warning. The gates of death.
Yeah. But I think it's consistent with the real emphasis that we see of that focus on the background or the things that are not paid attention to, right? That is actually the foundation for all the other things. And if you're not taking care of that, these other things that people are chasing after are just going to be problematic, and it's going to fall apart. It's not going to work properly. So there's a great deal of concern for paying attention to these treasures, of paying attention to the absence, of paying attention to the yin, of paying attention to the female, where everything else seems to be focused on, what's in the foreground, the actual 10,000 things, the chasing after power and strength and all the more masculine aspects. So it's very interesting and very powerful challenge to the normal way of looking at things, even in our own world, I think.
It's really interesting to me to see the consistency in what each chapter is delivering, but also the subtle differences in how it's all really, like, even though the differences are subtle, it's like pretty hard hitting still.
Yeah. Yeah. If you really pay attention to what they're saying, it's not insignificant. You
Yeah.
read it at a very surface level and think, oh, that's nice. But if you dig into it, you're like, oh, dang, that's
Whoa. Yeah.
yeah. So then we get to the conclusion. And this is another one where there's a couple of different options in the manuscripts that exist. And this is the lesser popular way, but I also agree with Roberts in his translation here that this is more consistent with what we've seen in the Daodejing as a whole. So he says, a mother's heart holds battle lines and also makes defenses sure. The alternative reading of this is that if we take mother's heart as the word compassion, which is frequently translated as, it says going into battle with compassion leads to victory and makes defenses sure. So you can kind of get to both directions, or both of the same endpoint with either of those. What would it mean to go into battle with compassion? But I think here it's not so eager about going into battle, right? It's the idea that if you really have that compassion, or if you have that mother's heart, it's going to hold, it's not going to rush into battle. And we've seen throughout the Tao Te Ching that there's not a like a pacifist stance, but it definitely looks at something like war as a complete breakdown of what should be, and something that even if you win a battle, it shouldn't be seen as like some type of victory party, but it says it should be celebrated like a funeral, because everybody loses when you go into war. There is no winner. So I like that this particular reading has it as it's like holding to those lines, like it's not rushing into battle, even though it's got that bravery. And if it has to, it will. And don't get between a mother and her child type of a situation. But the mother's not going to intentionally put her child in harm's way or try to bring her into or bring the child into a dangerous situation, right? It's always going to be looking for, how do we protect, how do we keep from something that could be, dangerous in that sense. And that also fits then with the second part of this too, about the defenses. It also shows us that we're still dealing with this chapter from a more of a political perspective. Definitely there's personal aspect of it, but it's ultimately trying to connect everything to the larger question of who are we as a people, and how do we do social, right? How do we do this living together kind of a thing? Then there's one final line. The man whom heaven means to keep, it protects with mother heart. Now, this is an interesting line because it could very easily be read as though heaven was somehow making decisions or trying to do things. But we've also seen that there's a heavy naturalist interpretation of heaven within the Daodejing. So there's a way that I think this could be understood in the sense that this natural aspect of how life unfolds is to, in a sense, give a mother's heart to people, or in this case, to the man. And it's that mother's heart then that seeks to protect the person, right? Having that compassion, having that kindness kind of within you is what then is allowing that protection to happen, as opposed to somehow heaven having a mother's heart and somehow orchestrating things in order to protect someone. I don't think that's the direction they go, even though you sometimes see this last part being translated in that direction. I think he brings out enough here to allow more of that naturalistic way of understanding what's happening, and that it's that, in a sense, that pre-wired, or in modern terms we might say that evolutionary psychology, the things that's built in us, this idea of compassion and how we have this love, especially for family and friends, is that thing that ultimately works to protect us.
To me, like, the more we dive into this chapter, the more I'm getting an image of like Atlas holding up the world, but instead of Atlas, it's a mom and her heart, you know? And also, like, it's not just war, right? It's any kind of conflict, any kind of situation where if somebody's upset, and maybe they're not upset at you, but maybe they're expressing it in a way that's, you know, tense or whatever, like, I don't know, a customer service situation, something simple like that. Somebody comes in and they're upset, right? If you approach them and match their behavior, then what does that look like, right? Well, it's just going to escalate. But if you approach them with patience and empathy and take it in that direction, then chances are the situation's going to turn out much different, right? Like they'll probably calm down and they'll probably end up leaving feeling a lot better than when they arrived. Um, so I think I really like that about this chapter. It's kind of highlighting the fact that like you don't have to meet that, I don't know, we'll just call it war, I guess. You don't have to meet that war or conflict where it's at. you can arrive there, and yeah, you might have scars on your heart, on your mother heart when you leave from dealing with it, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be a better approach.
Hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a contrast between the typical more patriarchal imagery and definitely bringing in more of a maternal. And I think it's important to say maternal instead of matriarchy, because when in my mind, and I don't know if this is exactly true in terms of how the words actually play out, but the idea of saying matriarchy versus patriarchy, it's like you're talking about the same system, but just a different person in charge, a gender, I should say. And frequently, this idea of how do we I get a sense in a lot of our media, movies and whatnot, when they try to show that women are equal to men, they do so by trying to make women act like men. And I don't get that. That's not what I think we should be trying to say. And so here, I think it's really trying to show more of this maternal versus patriarchy as opposed to a matriarchy, right? And yeah,
Highly
there's
recommend the Barbie movie for a movie that doesn't do it that way. It's very good.
yeah. So there's, you know, I definitely agree with you, Taylor. This chapter and really the book as a whole is really making more of that case. I like your imagery of swapping out Atlas with a mother and her mother heart, you know, is what's holding up the world. And you know, it's definitely a flip-flop, right? From what we're normally guided to look at or think that we're supposed to chase after. Chaz, what were you gonna say?
So this one, much like a lot of the other ones recently, have been about basically kind of like leadership, and this has a lot to do with the warring states period. So a lot of it has to do with war. When I think about these lines, I try to think about it in today's world, where of course we have war and politics and stuff, but you can kind of reduce it down to smaller things that's more relevant to your day-to-day experiences. And one of the thoughts that came to my mind was um, leaders, good leaders don't lead to lead. They are leading because they care. And I was trying to think of some examples of this, and two came to mind. One was like social media. Everybody's on social media. And for example, like YouTube. Every one of us watches YouTube, and I'm sure every single one of us follows someone on YouTube, right? And I was thinking about that, and it's like, why do we follow this person on YouTube? And it's usually about a specific subject or topic or that you're interested in, right? And I follow certain people because they are leaders in that realm, but not because they want to be a leader, but because they care about that topic so compassionately, like so hard that they know everything there is to know about it. And they are naturally getting that leadership. And then others are following that same person for the same reason, not because they are like, oh, I'm the best and you need to follow me. It's just because they care so hard. And the other example was it with like work. Since everybody has a job and everybody's dealt with um, work in some degree, good and bad experiences. I came down to like a manager, and I saw a post the one day, and it said, if you lose a manager and you're hiring for that manager, and the team doesn't fall apart while you're hiring for the manager, you need to stop trying to hire for a manager because someone in that team is already taking on those responsibilities and role, and you need to hire from within.
Hmm.
And it's just those kind of thoughts of kind of rang true for me with what was going through today of with what Taylor mentioned was like those foundational things, points you can see today in the world naturally, and it doesn't have to always relate to politics or like leaderships and global leaderships. It can be at the more minutia level.
Oh yeah, for sure. It definitely gives a lot of gradation for where we can apply this, both at our individual lives all the way up. And that's one of the things I find really fascinating about this book is it's not just kind of like this self-help book, but it's really trying to address even the larger questions in ways that are not typical. Whether or not it can actually be done, there's a lot of people who would question that, but I think that it's worth evaluating our current systems in light of this. And I think it brings an added perspective that is extremely valuable, even if somebody doesn't think that it's possible to fully do what it says. So it's kind of an interesting exercise, if nothing else, in terms of gaining perspective. Yeah. Well, this just about brings us to our time then. I want to, it's interesting as you were talking about people watching YouTube and following different people. I was thinking, maybe I should start telling people to subscribe to this channel. But then I thought, uh-oh, if I do that, then I'm going to be like trying to do it instead of people just naturally doing it. So you're kind of like in this bind of like, uh-oh, now I can't say anything.
I'll do it for you. Like and subscribe for Jim Jones.
That's right.
Plus the Kinship Cafe is what the channel is.
And
Yeah.
hit the bell so you get notified when Jim posts new videos.
There you go. Or
We'll do
if
it for
you
you.
would like to get emails with the latest videos and also a link to participate in this live discussion on Friday mornings, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe. And you also get an invitation to where we meet in person on Sunday mornings if you happen to be in the Southern California area. So hope to see you guys all next week, and we'll talk to you then.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.